Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. My name is Christian, and today I'm going to be walking you through our Week 14 waiver wire considerations. Congratulations, it's fantasy playoff time, and I hope that you guys made it in as me and Rob have. Pressure's really amping up, but we're having some fun. Going to talk about a few things as always. There'll be timestamps down in the description so you guys can hop around right now to whatever players you want to hear about and see who we're going to be talking about in today's video. One thing I do want to mention is that at the end of the video, I'll be talking about a few things as to why Rob isn't in this video and just some things generally going on in me and his life and how things have been going here at the FFP for those of you who are interested. But I'll leave that at the end for those of you who just don't care. As always, we'd say leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, or just want to tell me how dumb I am. I always enjoy those comments. But I'll definitely make sure to do a much better job this week of answering it than I did last week. Man, with crazy storms, we got like 2 feet of snow last night, getting stuck in the ditch, and I went to like 3 Thanksgiving dinners in one day. Things have been just crazy for me, so I didn't quite get around to as many question answering as I'd like to have this last week. My apologies. I feel like I say that every week, but it's something that's really important to me that I really want to try to do a good job at. Finally, guys, if you have won your division, if you have a bye, great, congratulations. Do not rest this week. Fantasy football is meant to be a very stressful and exhausting endeavor. That's probably not true, but that's certainly the way I treat it. And if you have a bye this week, do not sit on your duff, do not sit back, do not be lazy. Look towards next week and make the waiver wire moves that you need to make. Add a little, running back depth. Add a wide receiver. Maybe pick up a defense with a good matchup in case your defense disappoints this coming week and then make you nervous. A backup quarterback, whatever it may be. I think every single fantasy team out there has a weak spot. Granted, you made the playoffs, so it can't be that weak, but I guarantee you've got strengths and weaknesses, and I think you need to make sure to go pick up some moves now. Because if you got a bye, that means heading into next week, you're probably not going to have the waiver wire claim that you'd like, and you're probably not going to have first pickings at the players that you want. So do that now while you can. Have some foresight. Be smart about that. But I'm going to quit talking now. Let's just get right into the first couple of guys, and let's start talking about the players that we need to be picking up this week so we can advance in the playoffs. All right, guys, let's talk about it. First guy you need to take a look at is Bo Scarbrough at 56% available. If you're looking for a running back waiver wire pickup, he's probably the guy, the sole #1 guy to take a look at. Now, there's one downside to him, which is this week he's playing against the Minnesota Vikings. They give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. That's the downside. Pretty much everything else is upside. Not only has he played pretty well lately, he's actually had increased carries and a fair amount of volume. He went from 14 to 18 to 21 carries. And you know what, guys? I'll tell you right now, if you're going on the waiver wire looking for a running back waiver claim to make, you're not going to find another guy who's going to get you 21 carries in the game. That's crazy. But it's not just 21 carries. He's running the ball well, and he looks a lot like a LeGarrette Blount or a Derrick Henry. Probably leaning more towards the Derrick Henry there as far as the fact that he's been pretty darn effective. He's got 236 total rushing yards on the season. That's 4.45 yards per carry. And furthermore, a stat we don't get to talk about much during the regular season because we're so busy, but when the offseason comes, we really nerd out over this is one of my favorite stats to look at, is his yards after contact, which is a really great statistic at telling us not just how effective he has been, but how effective he has been when you remove the help of the offensive line. His yards after contact of 3.32 is one of the best in the NFL. That is very effective, and he's a very physical runner. That's something that we're not too surprised about. He has got a big frame, and he's a solid running back. Again, built very much like a Derrick Henry. It's funny because he's been very effective in an offense where Kerryon Johnson, Ty Johnson, DJ McKissick, and pretty much every other running back in that offense has struggled. He's really been the only guy to succeed, so I like him quite a bit. He's a guy that you should go after if you're looking at a running back. He's actually fairly high quality when you consider what you're giving up at this point, which is nothing. You just go make a waiver claim and hopefully you get him. Another guy to take a look at is Derrius Guice. Now, he does have more dynasty value than he does have value right now, but things are certainly looking up for him, and he is 51% available, so that's nice. Unlike Bo Scarbrough, he also has a good matchup this week. He plays the Packers. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, so that's great. Now, the problem is he's essentially splitting carries with Adrian Peterson. He got 10 carries this last week. Peterson got 13. He did get less, but he was far more effective with those carries. His 10 carries went for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was great. Peterson's 13 carries went for 99 yards and a touchdown. All around, that was just a good day of run blocking and an effective ground game, effective scheming by the coaches. So that was really great. All around, good job by the Redskins. Now, his yards per carry haven't been great. His yards per carry last game, where he had the 2 touchdowns this last week, 12.8 yards per carry. The 2 prior weeks, it was just 3.4 and 3.2. So, with the offense that we've seen right now and the way he's running right now, I'm not expecting this to be a guy who's going to manage, 10 carries and still get over 100 yards. There's no way. But after a week like that, I'd be hard-pressed to imagine them not giving him additional carries. I could very well see him this week getting up to, say, 15 carries and turning that into maybe 80 to 90 yards and a touchdown. There's certainly some risk involved, but it is a good matchup. And if you're looking for a waiver claim to replace injuries, maybe just add some depth, whatever it may be, or you're looking for a dynasty pickup guy, Derrius Guice is absolutely, and I mean absolutely, someone to consider. All right, so our first wide receiver for this video to take a look at has to be Deebo Samuels. He's got a good matchup this week versus the New Orleans Saints, who give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. This could definitely be a good matchup. Unlike their game versus the Ravens, I think if you're going to beat the Saints, I think you got to put up some points. I think you got to put up more than 17 or 20 points to win that game. And if they're going to do that, Deebo Samuels looks like a pretty big portion of that offense. Now, the last 2 weeks, he's had lower volume, only 6 targets. One of those games, they won 37-8. They didn't throw too much. That's sort of to be expected. Other than a tough matchup versus the Ravens, where there was, some bad weather, wet conditions, and against a tough defense, he still had back-to-back weeks with a touchdown. And when you go back to weeks 10, 11, and 12, 10 and 11, excuse me, he still had 21 targets, 16 catches, 246 yards. He's a very physical wide receiver. He's really starting to gain some great chemistry with quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo. If Garoppolo trusts him, maybe we should trust him too. He certainly had some good production, and this is a better matchup than he had versus the Ravens this week. In fact, weeks 10 through 12, when he had all those targets that I just mentioned, he generated a pass rating of 133.9. That is 5th among wide receivers in the NFL right now. He's been very productive, and like I said, you should pick the guy up. At 33% available, if you're looking for a wide receiver, this is definitely one of those guys to go to. Another guy to take a look at would definitely be Anthony Miller. Certainly don't like him as much as Deebo Samuel. There's a lot of risk involved, but he is red hot right now. The last 3 weeks, he had 11 targets, 6 catches, 54 yards versus the Rams. Then versus the Giants, he had 9 targets, 6 catches, and 77 yards. Finally, last week versus Detroit, 13 targets, 9 catches, and 140 yards. So he's really started to grow and have a much bigger impact on that offense as of recently. That coincides very much with the increased production of Mitchell Trubisky, who has struggled far less lately than he has in the past. However, over the last 4 weeks, they have played the Detroit Lions twice, and in those games, Mitchell Trubisky has combined for 6 touchdown passes. Great news, right? Except the Detroit Lions are one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL. And if you take those 2 games away, Mitchell Trubisky has just 7 passing touchdowns on the season. You can see why I'm not quite as hyped about him as I am as some other wide receivers. He is red hot, and one of those games versus Detroit when Mitchell Trubisky played so great, it wasn't even one of Miller's great games. He had just 1 catch for 7 yards. But all in all, considered this week versus Dallas, allowing the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. He is a low-end volume play in large leagues, probably nothing more, but he is definitely a guy to consider putting on your bench and playing in the right matchups. It being fantasy playoff time, I tend to be leaning furthermore away from him than I would if it were, say, 7 or 8 weeks ago in the middle of the regular season. But we're past that. Let's stick with what we're at now. I don't completely trust him, but he should definitely be rostered based on the way he's been playing. He definitely has PPR value, and his volume has just been increased quite a bit lately. All right, let's take a look at Cole Beasley. He has been red hot lately, and it's 68% available. I'm sure many of you are taking a look at him as a guy to consider. He's a guy who is kind of impressed this year. Earlier in the year, versus New England, he really stepped up in that game as John Brown was shut down by Stephon Gilmore. And he's really taken some steps to gain some chemistry and to really grow in that offense as it pertains to he's just worked a lot better with Josh Allen and started to become a very favorable target by Josh Allen. The last 2 weeks, he's been good weeks for him. He had 6 catches, 76 yards and a touchdown, and then 6 catches, 110 yards and a touchdown. So yes, the last few weeks have looked good for him, but not just the last 2 weeks, the last 7 weeks. In the last 7 games, he has had 5 touchdowns, and 8 times this season, he has double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. Things are looking really great for him. The bad news is this week, they do play the Ravens. The Ravens is a very good defense who's gotten a lot better lately. The Ravens defense did not start as good as they are now. They've definitely been improving as the year goes on, probably mostly due to some great coaching by John Harbaugh. All in all, he's got a limited ceiling and comes in for me as nothing more than a wide receiver 3 in leagues with 14 teams or more, but he's definitely a guy to consider to stash on your bench, especially in PPR leagues. Again, he's got some good volume and he plays good in tough matchups. James Washington. Normally I go into a player, I take lots of notes, I analyze all the numbers. I'm not even going to do that so much. I just want to tell you what his last 5 games have looked like because his last 5 games have been great. He had 4 catches, 69 yards versus the Indianapolis Colts. Pretty good pass defense. Then against the Rams, he had 6 catches, 90 yards, and a touchdown. Then he plays Cleveland. They lose 21-7, but he has 3 catches for 49 yards. Not great. Certainly could have been worse, though. Then the last 2 weeks have been great. Versus the Bengals, he had 3 catches, 98 yards, and a touchdown. And versus the Browns, he had 4 catches, 111 yards, and a touchdown. Coming into this season, we liked this guy. A lot of people liked this guy, and he disappointed. I think we're just now starting to see the type of wide receiver that James Washington can be, and things are only looking up for him. He is 78% available, and he plays the Rams this week, who give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and they give up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So if there were ever going to be a week for that Pittsburgh offense to throw the ball more and to be effective, especially pertaining to the value and the numbers that James Washington's going to have, this could very well be that week for him to just continue the trend in a very easy matchup. So I like James Washington. I'm not saying you have to start the guy, but I definitely feel like you have to pick him up. His production has been through the roof, and good for him starting to turn out to be that wide receiver that many thought he could be. All right, guys, it's time to do it. I don't want to. Nobody wants to. It's one of those uncomfortable situations, but let's just talk about the Kansas City Chiefs backfield. It's a mess. I'm going to say the sinful words, running back by committee. I know that makes everyone uncomfortable, but we just have to address the elephant in the room at this point. They got LaShawn McCoy. Yeah, he's got back-to-back weeks with a touchdown, but 5 carries for 10 yards last game. That's not productive enough. Damian Williams didn't even play last week, and he's been injured. We'll update you Friday and Tuesday as to what's going on with his health and when he'll be back to play. I'm not going to address that right now. Either way, he can't be trusted. Derrius Williams, he had 6 carries for 13 yards. He can't be trusted. Who can be trusted in this backfield? If anyone, it's Darwin Thompson. He is a rookie who was highly touted this offseason. People really liked him, and the only reason that he kind of fell was because they brought in LaShawn McCoy, and you got Damian Williams, who was hot, just red hot at the end of 2018. Then you bring in LaShawn McCoy. Of course, they've got Derrius Williams, who's actually been a moderately effective backup. I think people expected him to do more than that, but it was just enough of a backfield where he just kind of disappeared. But he led the backfield last week, 11 carries, 44 yards, and a touchdown. If there were ever, a guy that you're going to put your money on in that backfield, it would be Darwin Thompson. Don't get me wrong, he certainly has the most upside right now, but there's just too much. At any point, LaShawn McCoy could continue to get the touchdown. I would say at any point he could have a good week, but he's gotten touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, so it's not like he's not being used. He's not being used a lot, but he is certainly going to maintain a part of that offense. Damian Williams could come back. That could hurt his value. Heck, they could decide we want to try out Derrius Williams some more. So it is a big mess. I definitely think if you're in a keeper league, I definitely think if you've got an extra spot on your roster to throw just some running back on and you just want to stash a guy, just whatever, Darwin Thompson's definitely a guy to do that. I don't expect big things from him this week if you're looking to pick up a guy and make him your starter this week because he plays the Patriots, giving up the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. But when you take Bo Scarbrough off the list, the talent certainly starts to get thinner and thinner at the running back position, so he is certainly a guy to take a look at. All right, we've got Alan Lazard. Now this guy, it's just so interesting because he comes out of nowhere, starts to look like he's going to be Green Bay's number 2 wide receiver, and then he kind of played flat for a while, and we thought, okay, maybe that was wrong, but then suddenly he starts to come back, and maybe that is true. Maybe he's the number 2 wide receiver. He's a bit all over the place, but let me start from the scratch. He is 96% available, and he plays the Redskins this upcoming week, who do allow the 14th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, he's definitely a guy who's got high upside with his quarterback being Rodgers, but I'm not huge on him. Let me tell you why. He's a guy to take a look at if you have an empty roster spot, and especially if you're somebody who's you're in a competitive league or a deep league and you don't have a high waiver claim and you're not going to be able to get the number 1 wideout. He's definitely a guy to look at. Today he had a big day, 3 catches, 103 yards, and a touchdown. But one of the things that stood out to me was he had just 3 catches. I'm not going to break that down too much. 3 catches is just simply not enough for me to be in love with this guy. And the previous week, he had just 1 catch for 7 yards. So, yeah, I don't trust this guy. In Dynasty Leagues, I think he's got some more value. He's certainly worth taking a look at for those of us who aren't going to get the cream of the crop number 1 pick-ins. But I tell you what, I don't love him. Another running back to take a look at, a lot of risk here, but Raheem Mostert. Now, he is 88% available, which I love. What I don't love is he plays the Saints this week. They do give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, so that does kind of suck. Going back to last season, though, he has been probably the most consistent and productive running back for the 49ers backfield. He's got solid metrics and a solid yards per carry. In fact, in his career, he has a yards per carry of 6.1. He's simply a guy who came in the league in 2015 and has pretty much just lacked opportunity. When his reps, his touches have been increased, he's certainly increased his value. He's certainly used it well, but he just hasn't had enough. Now, he's had back-to-back weeks with a touchdown and 8 catches in the last 3 games. The flip side being the Matt Breida there, Tevin Coleman there, any one of those guys could have a big game. You're definitely taking a risk to pick this guy up and play this guy. For many of you, he should certainly be owned. The start-sit conversation is a whole other situation, a whole other monster to tackle. But take a look at it. Again, if you're not one of those guys who's going to have the number 1 waiver claim this week, and maybe there's not a lot of talent out there, he's definitely got to take a look at, as he does have huge upside. And he did just score a touchdown this last week versus the Ravens off of a huge, I believe it was a 40-yard run. And the Ravens are not a bad defense, so it's not like this coming week versus the Saints is an impossible matchup. It's just not a favorable matchup. I definitely think we have to take a look at Kirk Cousins. Now, he's only 20% available, but he's one of those guys where the stats speak for themselves, and in 1/5 of leagues, you should pick him up and play him. He plays the Lions, allowing the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. And I think that number actually gets a little bit worse. They had a couple of good weeks in the middle of the season, I believe weeks 4, 5, or 6, somewhere in there, where their defense played good. Every other week they have played bad. Get this, go back to against the Giants, he threw 306 yards and 2 touchdowns, 24 fantasy points. That's really good numbers for a quarterback who won 28-10 over a bad team. Typically when teams win by that much, their quarterbacks don't throw over 300 yards. Then against the Eagles, he scored 29 fantasy points, 333 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He followed that up versus Detroit, the team he's playing this week. The last time he played them, 338 yards and 4 touchdowns, 31 fantasy points. That was a huge day. Then they beat the Washington Redskins. Of course, Adam Thielen is out. They beat them 19-9. He still throws 285 yards, only manages 11.6 fantasy points. Again, a bit of a down week, but when you hold the Washington Redskins to just 9 points and you've got Dalvin Cook to run the ball, what do you expect from the guy? Do you really think he needs to have a big day? In fact, the fact that he threw for 285 yards, almost 300 yards, that alone is honestly sort of impressive. Follows that up versus the Chiefs. That is a bad loss for the Vikings, but not so much for him. He throws 3 touchdowns. He throws 2 touchdowns versus Dallas. That's another good day. Scores just about 20 fantasy points, and he scores about 27 fantasy points last week versus Denver, when he throws 319 yards and 3 touchdowns. He has been absolutely electric. The last 7 weeks for him, basically the last half of the season, have just been insane for him. Absolutely worth a play. Pick him up and put him in your lineup for sure. Now, another guy to pick up is Baker Mayfield. He's a guy who I believe had like 6 consecutive weeks with multiple touchdowns. He's a really guy who started off slow and was starting to turn it around, starting to play a lot better, of course. Jarvis Landry was really starting to be a great weapon for him. He is 23% available, and what I like is matchups. If you're going to stream quarterbacks, matchups matter. And he plays the Cincinnati Bengals this week, giving up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Then, he did have 3 good weeks, struggled versus the Steelers. That Steelers defense is very much improved recently. The added Mick Fitzpatrick, they've been playing very well, and that doesn't come as a massive surprise to me, so I wouldn't overthink that too much. Probably not my favorite quarterback option this week, but if you're in a deep league and pickings are thin, Baker Mayfield is not a guy who is unplayable. He certainly can be played. A guy that I do like is Ryan Tannehill. 61% available. He plays Oakland this week. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. And he has been just on an absolute tear lately. Now, when you look at the games, when you watch the games and you look at the game logs, he doesn't look like that great of a quarterback. He doesn't look like that great of a fantasy quarterback, especially on paper when you look at his weapons. But the production's been just there. Probably mostly due to the fact that he's been very mobile and getting a lot of rushing touchdowns. But when you look at it, the last 6 games, he has scored 25, 21, 25, 21, 34, and 15 fantasy points. And again, this is going into an easy matchup. I like Ryan Tannehill. He's been getting it done with his legs, with his arms. He's been very effective and seriously helped that Titans team right now. I definitely would play him in this matchup in a very much must win against the Raiders. All right, at 82% available, Zach Pascal is a wide receiver to consider picking up. Now, this is a waiver wire video, so I'm not going to say anything to the start sit of this other than the fact that he plays Tampa Bay this week. Tampa Bay gives up more fantasy points to any or every wide receiver that plays them. They give more fantasy points to wide receivers than any other team in the NFL, so that's a great matchup. The downside being this guy is the definition of bipolar, and you risk him having weeks like he had 2 weeks ago versus Houston, where he had 1 target and 0 catches and no fantasy stats. That's pretty bad. But he's so bipolar, the last time he played Houston, just a few weeks before, he had 6 catches, 106 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's 33.6 fantasy points for those of you who are at home and you don't know that. That is a massive day. He is so bipolar, so all over the place. In fact, last week versus Tennessee, a good pass defense, he had 10 targets, 7 catches, 109 yards. That is 19.9, basically 20 fantasy points. A very good play that week. Now, I think one of the reasons that he had such a big boost, by the way, those 10 targets were, I believe, season highs for him, probably came because of the absence of Eric Ebron, which really helped Jack Doyle, probably really helped Jack Doyle and Zach Pascal. So in a very good matchup this week, when you go from a good pass defense to a very bad pass defense, a very easy matchup, and another week with Eric Ebron on the IR, not going to be playing, he could be worth the risk as a plug-and-play wide receiver 3 or flex. Again, he could do what he did just a couple weeks ago and get you like 1 catch for 6 yards versus Denver, or 2 catches for 26 yards versus Miami. Yeah, there's a lot of risk involved, but could get you 100-plus yards. He could get you 2 touchdowns. And if you are going in just scraping into the first round of the playoffs with very few options, Zach Pascal is probably looking like a pretty good guy as far as giving you that upside that could push you over the edge. Alshon Jeffery, he's only 21% available. We got to talk about this guy. He plays the Giants, give him the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. He had 16 targets, 9 catches, 137 yards, and a touchdown versus Miami in the last game, which, by the way, was his first game back from injury. He's not highly available, but he must be owned. He is very productive, and he's got a great matchup this week. Devante Parker, man, this guy is the man of the hour, coming off a monster 7 catches, 159 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's like 43, 44 fantasy points. It was a massive day. Now he's only 20% available, but how could we not talk about this guy? He goes against not only coming off a huge week, not only coming off multiple huge weeks, because 3 weeks ago he had 7 catches for 135 yards, and 2 weeks ago he had 6 catches for 91 yards. So he's been a monster the last few weeks. But furthermore, He plays the Jets this week. They give up the third most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Devante Parker is a guy you definitely must own. He is red hot. When it comes to playing matchups, Parker is a pretty darn good bet this week. Jamaal Williams at 27% available. Consider him this week in a PPR league. Again, we've talked about this many times. He holds a lot less standard league value, but he can be a very low end RB2 or a flex play in PPR. Let's look at some of the reasons why. First being, plays the Redskins. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. That's great. And Jamaal Williams is 32 receptions on 37 targets this year, equates to a 86.5% catch percentage. This, by the way, is 4th best amongst the 34 qualifying running backs in the NFL, the average being a catch percentage of just 76. So he is far and away above many other guys, one of the top in the NFL. And he's a guy who's going to get you 10 plus carries and per game. And he's gotten you 19 catches in the last 4 games. He's also got 5 receiving touchdowns on the season. He definitely has a ceiling because of the production of Aaron Jones, but he seems pretty safe in PPR leagues. His production has been pretty solid all around. Though I don't love to start a running back who's a backup. Sometimes you're at the position that you're at, and I tell you what, I know some people in leagues with injuries and stuff would love to have Jamaal Williams in their lineup, and I would absolutely go for that in this good matchup. Because they're in a game against the Redskins that the Packers should definitely win, they could very well tend to give the ball more to Jamaal Williams as to rest Aaron Jones. That could happen. It's very possible. Another guy to look at is Rashaad Penny. Now, he's 45% available. I wanted to bring this up because I'm recording this before the Monday night game, which is Vikings versus Seahawks. Go Vikings, by the way. A little bit nervous. Seahawks are good right now. So I just want to say, watch that game. Watch how Rashaad Penny does, and watch the carries, right? Him and Chris Carson, who's getting the carries, who's getting the volume. That's going to be really important. I say this because last game he played last week, he had 14 carries, 129 yards, and a touchdown. If he can do anything similar to that this week against a tough Vikings defense, he is a must pick up. So make sure to be watching Rashaad Penny this week. Jack Doyle, if you're looking for a tight end, look nowhere else. At 43% available, he's got a great matchup. He's fairly highly available. He plays Tampa Bay this week, giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And with Eric Ebron on the IR, it gives us the one thing he didn't have, which was volume. He was a productive receiver who is, again, productive, and he's got a quarterback who likes to target him. I mean, what more could you ask from a tight end? Well, the one thing was that Eric Ebron was there. That was the one thing that hurt him. That doesn't hurt him anymore. He played this is his first game with Eric Ebron on the IR, his first game without him this year. He's got 11 targets, 6 catches, 73 yards, and a touchdown. And that trend could very well continue this coming week versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Gesicki, he's a bit more of a Dynasty League pickup guy, but he's been really turning it on lately, and he's absolutely a guy to consider. He's 81% available, and he plays the Jets this week. The Jets do give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but it's weird because one of his best weeks earlier this year was against the Jets. He's a guy who his production hasn't seemingly been tied to the matchups. That does make me nervous and makes him very unpredictable, but it does say, or at least give us the possibility that, hey, maybe this guy's going to really be a good tight end, and maybe at some point he'll even be one of those great tight ends that's matchup proof, right? It was a few weeks ago, he had 15.5 fantasy points, he had 6 catches and 95 yards versus the Jets. Had 2 bad weeks, and then he scored 12 fantasy points against the Cleveland Browns. He did score a touchdown in back-to-back weeks. Last week versus Philadelphia, had 5 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown. That is 18.9 fantasy points. So if you're looking for a guy to stash as a tight end 2 sort of guy or a possible deep end plug-and-play in larger leagues, Mike Gesicki is another guy to take a look at. But I got one more for you. Last guy to look at, and I probably don't like him as much as I like the other 2 guys, is Dallas Goedert. He seems like a very safe pick, but not the best pick. And here's why. They do play the Giants, allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and he is 36% available. For whatever reason, the New York Giants, the one thing that they seemingly can do well this year is, for whatever reason, stop tight ends. I don't know what it is. They just got a good set of linebackers and the way they scheme. He's been pretty productive. I believe he's got, 4 touchdowns in the last 8 weeks. So that's pretty good. And in fact, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the last, 7 or 8 games, he has scored 10 or more fantasy points. So he's been fairly productive in PPR leagues. Last week he had 7 targets, 6 catches, and 66 yards versus the Miami Dolphins. I don't love him, but if you're in a deep league larger than 12 teams and you need to plug and play a guy this week, Dallas Goedert can be one of those guys to plug and play. I don't like him as much as Gesicki. I definitely don't like him as much as Jack Doyle, but he's not unplayable. And he's definitely a guy who is certainly hurt by Zach Ertz. If Zach Ertz weren't there, he'd have far more volume. Because Alshon Jeffery played this week and he played like he was a healthy man, he played well, that also hurt him a little bit. This week versus the Giants, we'll see how that goes, but it is definitely playable. I don't love him. Wanted to throw him out there to give a third tight end option out there. Somebody did ask us the other day, hey, what are we supposed to do because last week I only talked about 2 tight ends. They said, both those guys are already owned. What do I do? So hopefully this third option will help you guys out. All right, guys, that is it. That is all of my players to consider for this week, at least for this video. One thing I do want to encourage you guys to do is leave a comment if you felt like I missed somebody. Is there a waiver wire consideration that you're taking a look at this week that I didn't talk about? I'd love to hear about it. There are plenty of players in plenty of different leagues, and I am sure that there is somebody out there who's considering a player that I didn't talk about. Heck, I pretty much guaranteed at this point, and I love you guys' feedback. Let's go back and forth. I want to hear what you're taking a look at. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is Rob wasn't in this video, and he won't be in any videos for the next month. He is going to be taking a month off from the channel. With everything going on, for those of you who don't know, things are kind of crazy. Of course, this is not our main job. This is just some side business that we're trying to start. I hate calling it a side business because it's very important to me. This is something that I'm absolutely 100% committed to, but we do still have, more pertinent, important things going on right now as far as, keeping our lives running and stuff. But while we continue to grow this. Because of that, Rob is going to have to step back for a month because he's dealing with my sister, constantly taking her down to get tests. She's going to be having brain surgery soon, and things are crazy. They went down for 5 days, had tests, came back for 1 day, and then they went all the way back. Had to drive all the way back out there for some more tests for like another 4 or 5 days, and heck, there was one test where they had to keep all of them awake or keep her awake for like a day and a half straight. It was crazy. So he's really exhausted. He's really worn down. He needs to step back just because of how crazy things have been. Again, I want to reaffirm to you guys that we are like 100% committed to this channel. This is one of the few things that I like really care about in my life, that I am like just all in on making sure like I'm going to continue to grow this. This is like a passion project, and hopefully eventually will be a career. So I don't want anyone to think that we're going to step back or slow down our production. He's just a little burnt out, a little exhausted, and he needs a little bit of break. That's just to let you guys know he won't be in the videos for a while. I'm going to be stepping up and taking everything over for right now. For you guys, sorry, I guess you're stuck with me for a while. That's unfortunate, but just figured I'd update everybody on that. As always, guys, I want to say thank you so much. You guys, you mean so much to us, really helping to support this and make this something that we can do, making it somewhat financially viable. Guys, you're really the best. You guys have a great day, and God bless.